am I too, I don't need to make it hypothetical. If I'm a skeptical conservative, I guess, or let's flip it. I'm a skeptical liberal looking at a funder, a big one, of a nonprofit journalistic outfit, also seeing the groups to which the same funder gives in other contexts,
Right.
see advocacy, maybe politics. I mean, I'm perfectly warranted. I'm justified to think, well, wait a minute. The funder, must see the journalistic grant as part of the same overall project, or is that too, is
Well,
that fair?
the way they see it, I think is not the same thing as what it is,
Yeah.
right? Um, for instance, at ProPublica, we had an absolute rule, which I know they maintain to this day, that no one outside the newsroom, including the board of directors, ever sees a story before it is published or knows what we are going to publish before we do. So no matter how many people think that's the way it works, it just isn't the way it works.
Yeah.
Um, so in that sense, the funders actually have far less influence than the owners of for-profit publications, but they're more in the position of advertisers. So for instance, at the Journal these days, I strongly suspect that Rupert Murdoch does occasionally know what's going to be published before it's published.
Yeah.
I don't think, though, that the advertisers at the Journal ever do. And
Yeah.
so the donors at a place like ProPublica have been put in the category in terms of their ability to influence things in the category of advertisers rather than owners.
Okay. I mean,
Now, you're right. If what motivates donors? What motivates donors are all sorts of different things. It's also true that in a broad sense, a lot of the money for nonprofit journalism comes from readers, which, as we noted earlier, is where a lot of the money for for-profit journalism comes. You are, I think, effectively dependent on your readers in ways that I think people increasingly, that people have not yet fully come to grips with. I think it is much more concerning in the real world how much editors may be willing to discomfort their readers than how much they are willing to discomfort their donors or their advertisers.
yeah. And that does, in my mind, bring up the Free Press article by Uri Berliner, where he was, I'll say, indicting or critiquing harshly NPR's concern with generating a new audience, really readers. It was a reader level concern for the most part, though he did mention, I think, the NPR Foundation's support of certain efforts in there. What did you make of that piece? And where does it fit within a concern about how funding flows affect coverage, really?
Yeah, so um, I read it quickly yesterday. I've never worked at NPR. To be honest, I'm not a huge NPR listener, although I have done some, and we worked extensively in NPR from time to time when I was at ProPublica. So that's the limit of my experience. I honestly thought a fair amount of it in the details felt to me off base. I mean, for instance, and I know this could send us down a rabbit hole, but he asserted he had three instances, and not sure I remember what all three of them were, but I remember very clearly that one of them was his assertion that it turns out there was no Russian collusion with the Trump campaign in 2016. So this is a subject about which I've read a lot and studied a lot because we covered it a lot at ProPublica and it was important to our work. That's not true, right? I mean, the Mueller report says we conclude actually that there was collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. And we also conclude that it is not that none of it rose to the level of being prosecutable. Right? It is also true that on quite a few people involved in the Trump campaign in 2016 ended up being convicted of felonies for their work in, with, and touching the Russian government. Michael Flynn, for instance, Roger Stone, for instance. So to say that there's no, it's a fact that there's no collusion, and therefore all the coverage before the Mueller report has been debunked, I just think is literally historically inaccurate.
Mhm.
Now, we can talk about the other two things if you can remind me what they were, but I
Oh,
thought
I'm
they
not
were,
going to remember.
frankly, I thought they were also a little bit off base in an empirical sense.
Right. I might not be asking about one of the other things, but the count in his complaint, as it were, of groupthink. And then he counts 87 contributors to Democrats or something and 0 to Republicans. Might there be a point there? And if so, I want to bring it back to philanthropy. Some skeptical conservatives, maybe cynical ones, would see similar groupthink at the top of establishment philanthropy. If it's the case that you might, if either one of those exists, or I guess if both of those exist, might they be related? This again, I guess this is the fourth version of my same question, but is there groupthink in journalism?
I think that groupthink is a big problem in almost any industry, and in almost any large organization. I think it's a real problem. I think it's a problem on the right and a problem on the left. I think it's frequently a problem, yes, in philanthropy, especially when different philanthropies get together.
Yeah.
And I've warned about this a couple of times publicly. Um, there's been a lot of talk, appropriately in my view, in recent years about the need for diversity in the news business. The news business was way behind the curve in reflecting the racial diversity of the country. And a lot of progress has been made on that. I think that's a very good thing. I think it has been less good, and we need more progress in reflecting the political diversity of the country, the class diversity of the country, the diversity of the country in educational background. One big issue in journalism has been one of the things that happened in the last century in journalism was journalism until probably the 1960s was a largely working class profession. And since the late 70s, certainly after Watergate, isn't anymore, right? So there's almost no one in newsrooms without a college degree in a country where a lot of people, a lot of adults don't have 4-year college degrees.
Mm-hmm.
Is that great? No, it's not great.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me quote your Substack pieces back to you and ask you maybe to expand on them a little bit. We noted in particular a piece that you had entitled "Why Philanthropy is a Business Model," and you meant there, I think, for journalism, though it could perhaps apply more widely, to in other contexts as well. But you said for grant makers, making journalism grants, quote, limits their freedom of action a bit, and quote, undermines the temptation for new leaders to pronounce new strategies. And I think there you meant for the journalism grant makers, but it might also be for the grant recipients. But
I think what I meant is institutional foundations have this unfortunate habit of changing their strategies every time they get a new president.
Yeah.
And, strategies should change when the world changes, not when somebody retires or gets fired.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's an unfortunate but widespread practice. And I think what I was saying is that major gifts, that is to say, from high net worth individuals who are not, and family foundations that are not institutional foundations, are in the long run healthier because they avoid that problem. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but most people in their personal philanthropy tend to be pretty consistent over time. They give to the places that they think are doing a good job. And until and unless those places stop doing a good job, they tend to give to them again and again and again.
Yeah.
Institutional foundations actually don't do that. They can frequently start and stop without respect to whether people have started or stopped doing a good job. It's not a great reason.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You had another great piece, which was sort of an after-action report. I don't want to call it I don't want to paint it in the wrong way, but you did have a piece called "What Went Wrong at the Center for Public Integrity," a nonprofit journalism organization outfit, and you spoke with several people who worked there. Of that, well, what did go wrong there, and what lessons could be drawn from what went wrong there for us and philanthropists on both sides of the ideology, with all differing worldviews, ideologically.
Yeah, I mean, what went wrong there was enormous management instability, a fair amount of strategic instability or incoherence, constant shifts. Um, you had literally the last four CEOs of the place in a row left abruptly. And to me, that kind of thing raises questions about a board, and particularly in a case where there was actually a lot of stability on the board. And I pointed that out. And, if you've got that kind of instability in management, um, boards need, boards are responsible. Boards have fiduciary responsibility, of course, and they need to take that more seriously, be more reflective, be more willing to look at their own behavior and practice and thought. And in a way that I thought at the Center for Public Integrity was somewhat disappointing.
I think some who spoke with you from there also noted, I'm trying to get funders in here, negative effects of limited purpose program funding, which
Absolutely.
some might see as strings. How, to the degree funders might be able to learn from what went wrong there, might it be related to that?
Yeah, no, and I think it was a big part of the problem. I mean, the responsibility for that problem always rests with nonprofit management. You do not have to take a program grant.
Yep.
And if funders are trying to restrict your activities or to unbalance the activities you're engaged in, or are unwilling to support the central apparatus that makes the whole thing go, you can say no, and you can be smaller, and sometimes you need to be. Um, there's nothing wrong with program grants as opposed to general operating support. I do think it's wiser, if you can, to make general operating grants. But I understand why many funders don't want to do that. Um, uh, but then the responsibility rests on management to say, that's either not of interest to us, or it is of interest to us, but we can't let it become that much of our place.
Yeah. Yeah. But if you have to pay the light bill and you can't without the grant, I'm just painting a darker picture.
Then turn off the lights, right? I
Yeah.
mean, or turn, it's usually turn down the lights, right? Because if you simply say, we'll take every grant anybody in the world wants to give us for anything they want to do, then you have surrendered the direction of the place to the people who want to give you the money,
Mhm.
who pretty much by definition don't understand your business as well as you should.
Well, since we've gotten some free advice from you, tell me about the Gallatin Advisory LLC project of yours.
So you're kind to ask. I mean, since I retired from ProPublica, I do basically three things. I write this newsletter, which is fun for me, about the business of journalism, and I teach some about journalism and communications, actually mostly about public health and communications. And then I do some consulting. It's mostly for boards or funders or CEOs looking to either at strategic and sometimes quite detailed operational questions, but who think I might be able to help them see around corners or see through problems.
Great.
And try.
Well, Dick Tofel, thanks so much for doing this with us. We totally appreciate it.
My great pleasure.